David Hamilton was a man who had, by all outward appearances, achieved everything he had ever wanted in life. At 45 years old, he was a successful architect, well respected in his field, and had built a comfortable life for himself and his family in a quiet suburban neighborhood. David had always been the epitome of calm, collected, and confident qualities that had drawn people to him throughout his life. His tall, athletic frame and strong features only added to the air of authority he exuded. David had grown up in a small town in upstate New York, the eldest of 3 children in a middle-class family. His father had been a carpenter, and from a young age, David had a fascination with building things. This passion eventually led him to study architecture, and after years of hard work and dedication, he had risen to the top of his profession. Lisa, David's wife, was 10 years his junior, a vibrant and outgoing woman who had once worked as an interior designer before choosing to focus on raising her son Alex. Lisa had met David when she was 27, shortly after her first marriage had ended in divorce. She had been drawn to David's stability and maturity, qualities that had been sorely lacking in her previous relationship. They married after a brief courtship, and David quickly embraced the role of stepfather to Alex, who was only 9 years old at the time. Lisa was deeply in love with David, appreciating the way he provided for their family and the security he offered after the instability of her first marriage. Alex, now 19 years old, had grown up in the shadow of David's achievements, and while he admired his stepfather, he often felt inadequate by comparison. Alex was a handsome young man with dark hair and green eyes, his features still holding the soft edges of youth, though adulthood was fast approaching. He was intelligent and creative, traits he had inherited from his mother, but he had always struggled to find his own path. While David's professional success had been a source of pride for the family, it had also set a high bar that Alex felt pressured to meet. He had grown up in the same suburban town where they still lived, a place that was safe, predictable, and, to Alex, suffocating. He had a few close friends and had recently started his first year of college, though he had yet to declare a major. Alex's relationship with his biological father had always been strained. His parents had divorced when he was only 5 years old, and his father had remarried and started a new family shortly thereafter. The infrequent visits and lack of emotional connection left Alex feeling abandoned and resentful. When David entered his life, Alex was desperate for a father figure, someone who could fill the void left by his own father's absence. David, in turn, was eager to step into that role, and for many years their relationship was one of mutual respect and affection. David had been patient with Alex, offering guidance and support without ever pushing too hard, and Alex had come to see him as a father in every way that mattered. However, as Alex entered his teenage years, the dynamic between him and David began to shift. The admiration Alex felt for David grew into something more complex and confusing. David, who had always been attentive and involved in Alex's life, started to notice the subtle changes in Alex's behavior. The boy who had once idolized him now seemed to seek out his approval in ways that felt different, more intense. There was a new tension between them, one that neither of them could fully understand or articulate. The turning point came during the summer before Alex started college. With Lisa often away visiting her aging parents, David and Alex found themselves alone together more frequently. It was during these moments that their bond deepened in ways neither had anticipated. What began as innocent conversations about Alex's future and his struggles with his identity soon veered into more personal territory. David found himself drawn to Alex's vulnerability, his need for guidance, and the way he looked at him with a mix of admiration and something else, something unspoken but undeniable. David, who had always prided himself on his self-control, was caught off guard by the feelings that began to surface. He had never thought of himself as someone who would cross such a boundary, but there was something about Alex's sincerity and the way he sought his approval that stirred something deep within him. He told himself that he was just being supportive, that he was helping Alex through a difficult time, but the rationalizations grew thinner as the connection between them intensified. For Alex, the confusion was even more profound. He had always looked up to David, but now those feelings were tangled with something darker and more complicated. He found himself drawn to David in ways that both excited and terrified him. The lines between admiration, respect, and desire blurred, and Alex was too young and inexperienced to understand what was happening. He knew that what he was feeling was wrong, that it crossed boundaries he had never considered before, but he couldn't help himself. The moments they spent together were the highlight of his day, even as they filled him with guilt. It started with small things: David's hand resting on Alex's shoulder a little longer than necessary, the way their conversations drifted into more personal territory, the subtle glances that lingered just a second too long. These moments were electric, charged with a tension that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt acutely. The bond between them grew stronger, and with it, the risk of discovery. As the summer progressed, David and Alex found themselves in situations where the boundaries of their relationship were tested. One evening, while Lisa was away on one of her trips, David and Alex sat together in the living room watching a movie. It was a quiet, unremarkable evening, but there was an underlying current of anticipation. As the movie played, David noticed Alex shifting uncomfortably beside him. When he asked if something was wrong, Alex hesitated before admitting that he was struggling with his feelings he didn't fully understand or know how to express. David, sensing that this was a critical moment, chose his words carefully. He reassured Alex that it was normal to feel confused, that everyone goes through periods of uncertainty, especially at his age. But as the conversation continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted. David found himself reaching out, placing his hand on Alex's knee, offering comfort in a way that felt both natural and loaded with implications. Alex didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at David with an intensity that made David's heart race. That night marked the beginning of their secret relationship. What started as an emotional connection soon became physical, each encounter pushing the boundaries of what they had previously considered acceptable. They were careful, always making sure that Lisa wasn't around, always hiding their interactions behind closed doors. But the secrecy only heightened the thrill, making the connection between them feel even more powerful. David was torn. On one hand, he knew that what he was doing was wrong, that he was betraying Lisa and crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But on the other hand, the connection he felt with Alex was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if he had found a part of himself that had been missing, a deep primal need that had finally been fulfilled. He justified his actions by telling himself that he was helping Alex, that he was providing the support and understanding that the young man so desperately needed. But deep down, David knew that he was driven by his own desires, that he was acting out of selfishness rather than any noble intention. Alex, meanwhile, was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. He had never felt so close to anyone before, and the attention he received from David made him feel special, valued in a way he had never experienced. But the guilt was always there, gnawing at him, making him question what they were doing. He knew that if Lisa found out, it would destroy her, and that thought terrified him. Yet, despite his fears, he couldn't bring himself to end the relationship. The pull he felt toward David was too strong, too overwhelming. As the summer came to an end and Alex prepared to leave for college, the tension between him and David grew more palpable. They both knew that once Alex was gone, it would be harder to maintain their secret, and the thought of being apart filled them both with dread. Their final days together were marked by a sense of urgency, as if they were trying to hold on to something that was slipping through their fingers. In the days leading up to Alex's departure, David's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was moody and withdrawn, his mind consumed with thoughts of what would happen once Alex was no longer living under the same roof. He began to question whether their relationship could survive the distance, whether they could continue to keep it hidden. The fear of losing Alex drove him to take risks he would have never considered before, pushing the boundaries of their relationship even further. Alex, too, was struggling with the impending separation. He had always been close to his mother, but his relationship with David had become the center of his world, and the thought of leaving that behind was almost unbearable. He became more clingy, more desperate for reassurance from David, who responded with a mixture of affection and frustration. The pressure was mounting, and it was only a matter of time before something had to give. The night before Alex was set to leave for college, David and Alex found themselves alone in the house once again. They sat together in David's study, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken emotions, the air thick with tension. Neither of them wanted to acknowledge the reality of the situation, but it hung over them like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. As the summer faded into autumn, the once vibrant warmth of the Hamilton household began to wane, replaced by an undercurrent of tension and secrecy that threatened to unravel everything. Alex had left for college, and with his departure, the hidden bond between him and David was strained, stretched thin by distance and the challenges of maintaining their clandestine relationship. What had once been a thrilling, forbidden connection now became a source of anxiety and fear for both of them. David, now 45, found himself slipping into a routine that felt increasingly hollow without Alex around. The house was quieter, and though he still had his work to occupy him, his thoughts frequently drifted back to the young man who had become such a central figure in his life. David had always been a man of structure and discipline, but the turmoil of his emotions had started to erode that control. He began to question the choices he had made, the risks he had taken, and the morality of the relationship that had come to dominate his thoughts. Lisa, David's wife, was perceptive enough to notice the changes in her husband's behavior. At 35, she had always prided herself on her ability to keep her family together, to manage the challenges that came with blending a family. But now, she could sense that something was off. David was distant, preoccupied, and there were moments when she felt like she was living with a stranger. The easygoing, affectionate man she had married seemed to be slipping away, replaced by someone who was often lost in his own thoughts, unreachable. David's work, which had once been his refuge, began to suffer as well. His colleagues noticed that he was increasingly distracted, missing deadlines and making uncharacteristic mistakes. The pressure to maintain the facade of a successful professional life while dealing with the emotional turmoil of his secret relationship was taking its toll. David tried to focus, to throw himself into his projects, but the thoughts of Alex and the distance between them gnawed at him incessantly. Alex, now a college freshman, was also struggling with the separation. He had moved to a university a few hours away, excited by the prospect of independence and the new experiences that college life promised. But the reality was far more complicated. The freedom he had yearned for felt hollow without David by his side. He had expected to find a sense of purpose, to discover who he was outside of the shadow of his family. Instead, he felt adrift, isolated in a sea of unfamiliar faces and new expectations. The university was a prestigious one, and Alex found himself surrounded by students who were driven, ambitious, and focused. He tried to fit in, to immerse himself in his studies, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was only going through the motions. His thoughts constantly returned to David, to the secret they shared and the powerful emotions that had drawn them together. The distance made their relationship more difficult to sustain, but it also intensified Alex's longing for David. Every text message, every phone call, was a lifeline, a connection to the world he had left behind. But as the weeks turned into months, the strain of maintaining their secret relationship began to show. The text messages that had once been filled with warmth and affection became terse and sporadic. David's phone calls were often rushed, his voice tinged with stress and worry. Alex could sense that something was wrong, but he didn't know how to address it without risking everything. He became more insecure, more desperate for David's attention and reassurance, but that only seemed to push David further away. Lisa's suspicions, meanwhile, continued to grow. She noticed the way David's demeanor changed when he received messages on his phone, the way he would retreat to his study for long periods, emerging with a troubled expression. She had always trusted David, but now, for the first time, she began to doubt that trust. She started to wonder if there was something, or someone, that David was hiding from her. One evening, after another day of strained silence, Lisa decided to confront David. She had been turning the situation over in her mind for weeks, trying to find a logical explanation for the changes she had noticed. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. David was in his study, as usual, and Lisa knocked softly on the door before entering. She found him sitting at his desk, staring at his phone, his face a mask of concentration. "David," she began, her voice tentative, "is everything okay? You've been so distant lately, and I'm starting to worry." David looked up, startled, and quickly put his phone down. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Lisa. Just a lot on my mind with work. You know how it is." But Lisa wasn't satisfied with that answer. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man she knew. "It's more than just work, isn't it? I can tell something's bothering you. Please, talk to me." David felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess the secret that had been eating away at him. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. The consequences were too great, the risk of losing everything too terrifying. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Lisa, I'm sorry if I've seemed distant. It's just, there's been a lot going on, and I didn't want to burden you with it. But I promise, there's nothing to worry about." Lisa nodded, but the doubt in her eyes remained. She wanted to believe him, but something inside her told her that he wasn't being completely honest. That night, as they lay in bed together, Lisa lay awake long after David had fallen asleep, her mind racing with questions she didn't have the answers to. The next day, Lisa decided to take matters into her own hands. She had never been the type to invade David's privacy, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong drove her to do something she never thought she would. While David was at work, Lisa went into his study and began searching for any clues that might explain his behavior. She felt guilty as she rifled through his desk drawers and papers, but her need to know the truth overrode her sense of guilt. Finally, she found what she was looking for. Hidden in the bottom drawer of David's desk was an old phone, one that she didn't recognize. Her heart raced as she powered it on, and when the screen lit up, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The phone was filled with messages between David and Alex, messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Lisa's hands trembled as she scrolled through the texts, her mind struggling to process what she was reading. The affectionate words, the intimate details, they all pointed to a relationship that went far beyond the boundaries of what was acceptable. The realization that her husband and her son had been involved in something so deeply wrong shattered her world. In a state of shock, Lisa put the phone down and collapsed into David's chair, her mind reeling. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and devastated all at once. The man she had trusted, the man she had built a life with, had been carrying on a secret affair with her son. The implications were too horrifying to comprehend, and Lisa's thoughts spiraled into a dark place. David, unaware of Lisa's discovery, continued to struggle with his own demons. The guilt he felt was overwhelming, and the strain of maintaining his double life was pushing him to the breaking point. He knew that their secret was becoming harder to keep, that the chances of being discovered were growing by the day. Every time he spoke to Alex, he could hear the tension in the young man's voice, the desperation that mirrored his own. One evening, as David sat alone in his study, he received a call from Alex. The moment he answered, he could tell that something was wrong. Alex's voice was strained, his words hurried and frantic. "David, I don't know how much longer I can do this," Alex confessed, his voice trembling. "It's tearing me apart. I miss you, but I can't keep living like this. The guilt is killing me." David felt a pang of sorrow in his chest. He had been trying to keep it together for both their sakes, but hearing the pain in Alex's voice brought everything to the surface. "I know," David replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "I feel the same way. But we can't let this destroy us. We have to find a way to make it work." But Alex wasn't reassured. He was overwhelmed by the weight of their secret, the constant fear of being discovered. He had tried to focus on his studies, to build a life for himself at college, but the shadow of their relationship loomed over everything he did. He had started to pull away from his friends, isolating himself in his dorm room, unable to escape the thoughts that haunted him. As the weeks passed, Alex's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped attending classes, withdrew from his social circles, and spent most of his time alone, consumed by his thoughts. The once bright and promising young man was fading, replaced by someone who was barely recognizable. David tried to reach out, to offer support, but the distance between them made it difficult to connect in the way they once had. The days that followed Lisa's discovery were filled with an unbearable tension that permeated every corner of the Hamilton household. Lisa's once vibrant personality had withered, leaving her a shadow of the woman she had been. The knowledge of David's betrayal was like a poison, slowly seeping into every aspect of her life, and the burden of keeping this secret weighed heavily on her. She couldn't bear to look at David without feeling a surge of anger and disgust, yet she said nothing, fearing the confrontation that seemed inevitable. The strain was beginning to take its toll on everyone. and it was only a matter of time before something gave way. David, oblivious to Lisa's discovery, was drowning in his own guilt and fear. The relationship he had with Alex, once a source of forbidden excitement, had turned into a nightmare. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, had made it increasingly difficult to maintain any semblance of normalcy. David found himself oscillating between moments of intense longing for Alex and overwhelming dread at the possibility of being discovered. Every time he spoke to Alex, he could sense the young man's distress, his voice tinged with desperation and hopelessness. Alex was spiraling out of control. The once promising college student was now a shell of his former self, consumed by the guilt and shame of his relationship with David. He had withdrawn from his classes entirely, barely leaving his dorm room except to get food or attend the occasional mandatory meeting with his advisor. He avoided his friends, unable to face them, and spent most of his time locked in his room, staring at the walls or lying in bed, his mind racing with dark thoughts. The isolation and the pressure of keeping such a terrible secret were pushing him to the edge, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold on. One evening, after a particularly harrowing phone call with David, Alex made a decision. He couldn't continue living this way. He needed to escape, to find a way out of the mess his life had become. In his mind, there was only one solution. He packed a small bag with a few essentials and left his dorm room in the middle of the night, not bothering to tell anyone where he was going. He boarded a bus to the town where he had grown up, where his mother and David still lived. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to do when he got there, but he knew that he needed to confront the situation head-on, to find some kind of resolution, no matter the cost. When Alex arrived at the Hamilton house, it was late, well past midnight. The house was dark, save for a single light on in David's study. Alex's heart pounded as he approached the front door, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. He hesitated, wondering if he was making a mistake, but then the thought of continuing to live in this hell drove him forward. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside, the familiar scent of his childhood home washing over him in a wave of nostalgia and pain. David was sitting at his desk, lost in thought, when he heard the sound of the front door opening. He looked up, startled, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw Alex standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had happened between them hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Alex," David finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't take it anymore," Alex replied, his voice trembling. "I had to see you. I had to talk to you." David stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He crossed the room in a few quick strides and pulled Alex into an embrace, holding him tightly. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the connection between them. But the moment was fleeting, and reality soon came crashing back in. "Alex, we can't keep doing this," David said, pulling back slightly to look into Alex's eyes. "It's tearing us both apart. We need to find a way to stop before it destroys everything." "I know," Alex replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how. I don't know what to do." As they stood there, holding each other in the dimly lit study, neither of them noticed the figure standing in the doorway. Lisa had heard the front door open and had come downstairs to investigate, only to find the two people she loved most in the world locked in an embrace that was anything but innocent. The sight of them together, their bodies pressed close, shattered the last vestiges of her denial. All the suspicions, all the doubts, were now confirmed in the most horrifying way possible. Lisa's voice cut through the air like a knife, cold and sharp. Both David and Alex turned to see her standing there, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock and fury. "Lisa," David began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find the words to explain the inexplicable. But Lisa didn't want to hear it. The betrayal was too much, the pain too raw. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. "How could you do this to me? To us?" David's mind raced, trying to find some way to diffuse the situation, but there was nothing he could say that would make it right. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now the consequences were coming home to roost. Alex, meanwhile, felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. The look on his mother's face was one of such deep hurt and betrayal that it cut through him like a blade. He had never wanted to hurt her, but now he saw the full impact of his actions laid bare. "Mom, I'm sorry," Alex began, but Lisa silenced him with a look. "Sorry," she repeated, her voice rising in anger. "You're sorry? That's all you have to say?" The tension in the room was unbearable, and David knew that he had to say something, to try to salvage what little was left of their family. "Lisa, please," he began, his voice pleading. "Let's just sit down and talk about this. We can work through it." But Lisa wasn't listening. The pain and anger were too much, and she lashed out, her voice filled with venom. "There's nothing to talk about, David. You've destroyed this family. You've destroyed everything." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and David knew that there was no coming back from this. The truth was out, and there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. In the days that followed, the Hamilton household descended into chaos. Lisa, unable to bear the sight of David and Alex, packed a bag and left the house, seeking refuge with a friend. She couldn't bring herself to file for divorce, not yet, but she knew that the marriage was over. The trust had been shattered, and there was no way to rebuild it. David, for his part, was left alone in the house that had once been his sanctuary. The walls that had once felt like home now felt like a prison, and the silence was suffocating. He tried to reach out to Lisa, to apologize, to explain, but she wouldn't take his calls. The guilt and regret that had been simmering under the surface now boiled over, consuming him in a wave of despair. Alex, meanwhile, was adrift. He had returned to college, but the weight of everything that had happened was too much to bear. He couldn't focus on his studies, couldn't find any joy in the things that had once brought him happiness. The relationship that had once felt so thrilling and forbidden now felt like a curse, and he couldn't escape the feeling that he had ruined everything. As the weeks turned into months, the situation only grew worse. David's work suffered, and he began to lose clients. His once promising career was now in jeopardy, and he found himself questioning everything he had worked for. He started drinking more heavily, using alcohol to numb the pain and guilt that plagued him. The man who had once been so confident and in control was now a shadow of his former self, lost and directionless. Alex, too, was struggling to cope. He had started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some way to deal with the overwhelming emotions that were consuming him. But the sessions were painful, forcing him to confront the reality of what he had done and the impact it had on those he loved. He had always seen himself as a good person, someone who tried to do the right thing, but now he was faced with the truth of his actions, and it was almost too much to bear. One evening, several months after the confrontation, David received a call that would change everything. It was from Lisa, and her voice was cold and distant as she told him that she had made a decision. She was filing for divorce, and she wanted him to know that there was no chance of reconciliation. The marriage was over, and she wanted nothing more to do with him. The call was the final blow, the last nail in the coffin of the life David had once known. He hung up the phone and stared at the walls of his study, feeling the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on him. The guilt, the shame, the regret, it was all too much, and for the first time, David found himself considering the unthinkable. The next morning, when David didn't show up for work, his colleagues began to worry. He had always been reliable, and it wasn't like him to miss a day without calling. When they couldn't reach him by phone, they decided to go to his house to check on him. When they arrived, they found the house dark and silent. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. One of them tried the door handle and found it unlocked. They entered the house, calling out for David, but there was no response. When they found him, it was too late. David had taken his own life, unable to bear the weight of his actions and the destruction they had caused. The news spread quickly, and the shock and grief that followed were palpable. Those who had known David struggled to make sense of what had happened, to reconcile the man they had known with the tragedy that had unfolded. For Alex, the news of David's death was devastating. He had always felt a deep connection to David, a bond that went beyond the physical, and now that bond was severed in the most final and brutal way possible. The guilt and grief overwhelmed him, and he struggled to find a way to cope with the loss. He felt as though his world had crumbled around him, leaving him alone and adrift in a sea of pain and confusion. Lisa, too, was left to grapple with the aftermath. The anger and betrayal she had felt were now mixed with guilt and sorrow. She had wanted to punish David for what he had done, but she had never wanted this. The man she had loved, the father of her son, was gone, and she was left to pick up the pieces of the life they had once shared. In the weeks that followed, the Hamilton family tried to find a way to move forward, but the scars of what had happened ran deep. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love was now empty, a reminder of everything that had been lost. The silence was oppressive, and the memories of what had been haunted those who remained. For Alex, the future was uncertain. He knew that he had to find a way to live with what had happened, to move forward and build a new life for himself. But the road ahead was long and difficult, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength to walk it. As the seasons changed and the world moved on, the Hamilton family remained trapped in the past, their lives forever altered by the choices they had made. The descent into darkness had been swift and brutal, and the light that had once filled their lives was now just a distant memory.